Hey everyone, it's time for another good word from God's Word. Hope you're doing awesome this week, even on this day of remembrance, to remember September 11th and all those that were lost on that day. If you were pretty much 20 years old or older, you probably remember where you were on that day. Well, maybe a little older than 20, because that was 20 years ago. Maybe 25 or older. But I remember growing up and hearing about Pearl Harbor and how everyone talked about that was the day that everyone remembered that happened, and it just being so detached from it. And then September 11th happened, and it's like I had lunch with some friends today, and then we even talked about where we were that day. And there's been a lot of group discussions about where we were on that day. But we always have to remember, even though horrible things happen, we can always find some good in it. And there's no doubt about it, September 11th is a tragedy, and it was one of the darkest days in our country. But whenever a tragedy happens, what you got to do is you got to look for the helpers, look for those brave men and women who gave their lives and gave even more, and gave their lives, and some that survived, that they ran in to help those people and save those people when it went in there. And so there's still people who are still hurting from that, and so we need to pray and remember those people and bring comfort to them, just because it matters, and we need to remember what's there. So if you've been reading with us through the Bible, we are reading chapter by chapter, and we have made it to 1 Samuel 17. And let me just tell you, as a person whose name is David, reading about David is like the best. It was the stories. I studied those stories. I read those stories as a kid. Thankfully, my parents didn't have me read it from the Bible. I had a storybook Bible, because this stuff gets pretty violent and pretty gruesome as you get in there, especially when you get into 1 Samuel 18. I remember reading that as an adult. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is gross. And if you want to know what I'm talking about, you're going to have to read it yourself. But 1 Samuel 17 is the epic story of David and Goliath. Woo! David and Goliath is it's one of the most famous stories out of the whole Bible, and it's just part of our normal lexicon of a David versus Goliath. You can hear that it's a David versus Goliath. And one thing that I've noticed about Americans in our culture is that we love an underdog, and David in this story is the ultimate underdog. So let me just kind of lay some cultural context for what's happening in the story. Why are they doing it this way? And so that we can draw some spiritual principles out of what happens in 17 and then what follows in 18. So what happens is the two armies, they set up on two different hills, and they just kind of stare down at each other. And what happened was because this was like the entirety of these two armies. So a lot of times they wouldn't go and just attack each other, Braveheart style, and just fight. A lot of times what they would do is they would send out a champion to go out and fight, and the best fighter of each one of those from each one of those armies would duke it out, and whoever won that battle, that was whoever won of those two guys, then that's who won the battle of that day. And so that is what's happening here with Goliath, with the Philistines, and with the Israelites, is that they're coming at each other, but instead of throwing their armies at each other, which it will eventually happen, the Philistines send out their best warrior, which is Goliath, who is a literal giant. He's gigantic. He's super strong. And so he's there, and he's calling out their commander. Now, if you watched last week's where I talked about how Saul won his great battle, and that was ultimately what led him to the king, part of the reason why he was king is because he became the greatest warrior. So the person who should have come out is Saul, but Saul didn't do it. Saul was hanging out and hiding inside of the tent. And so the rest of the kingdom, the rest of Saul's army, they are shaking, and they are scared, and they are full of fear, because their king, the person who's supposed to fight for them, the person who's supposed to represent them, is not doing it. And he's putting out requests and saying, who wants to go fight him? And nobody wants to do it, because the person who's supposed to be the source of courage for them, their source of strength, the person they look to fight for them, is not doing it. And then here comes little old David. Now, David is probably 14, 15 years old. He is not old enough to go fight yet, but his older brothers are, and so he's just being a runner back and forth. This is not uncommon for these times. If you've seen the Civil War things, the little drummer boys, those are those little boys who just drum before they're not old enough to carry a weapon. And this is basically what David is doing. He's running supplies back and forth to his older brothers, and he hears what's happening with Goliath, and he's seeing no one stand up, including his older brothers. And his older brothers are like, and David's like, who's doing this? And his older brothers, be quiet. You can't, who do you think you are? And the older brothers are trying to shoot down David for standing up and saying stuff, and it's like, look, you're just trying to get the glory for yourself. And David's like, no, this guy is speaking against my God, because here's what David knew. David knew that while everyone was looking to Saul to be their courage and be their strength, David knew that the real courage and the real strength came from God and God only. And so he goes and he says, hey, I will fight him. Saul tries to give him his armor because, hey, if you're going to go fight him, we're going to give you the best equipment. He's just trying to, protect this boy, because, if David loses, that's it for the Israelite army. But that also shows the fear that King Saul had, how desperate he was. I mean, they've been out there for 40 days of Goliath taunting them, and David still hasn't. And David is the first one to raise his hand and say, I will go. That's how desperate they were. I can't believe Saul even trusted him. And so David goes out there, he gets the 5 smooth stones, and he says this in verse 17. Let me see if I can get it here. He says this right before he goes in there. He says, it is in chapter 17. David said, in chapter 17, verse 45, he says, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. David's saying, look, I don't care who you are, who you think you are. I don't care how strong you are. I don't care that you call me a dog. I am fighting for the Lord. And he takes and throws the stone, kills David, chops off his head. The Israelites charge. They kill all the Philistines. It's a great battle. 1 Samuel 17. David and Goliath. Ultimate underdog winning the battle. But then chapter 18. A lot of people don't read 18. But 18 is the rest of the story. Like we said before, and what we said a week ago when we looked at David and when we looked at Saul, how he won his big battle. This is David's first battle. This is David starting to become the greatest warrior, and that's what we find in 18. He starts fighting and he starts winning, and Saul is like, look at this golden boy, and he keeps promoting him and keeps putting him up in there, and then everyone starts singing this song in chapter 18. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 7, they said, the people are singing, and they said, as they danced, they sang, the women of Israel, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. So Saul is already a prideful man. He is the king of everything. He was the greatest warrior, and now they're saying that David is actually the greatest warrior, and Saul, while he's great, he's not as good as David. So this is hurting Saul's pride. This is hurting his ego. And Saul has to figure out what to do, because now he knows. This is the first sign that he starts realizing he is about to lose his kingdom. And that's what sets this whole thing up of David going out in the wilderness that we're going to read in the next couple of chapters, of Saul chasing him down and trying to kill him. Saul keeps trying to put obstacle and obstacle and obstacle in David's way, and trying to get him killed by the Philistines, just so he doesn't have this problem. He doesn't have to be worried about it. Worried about David taking his throne, because at this point David is best friends with his oldest son Jonathan, and he gets married to one of Saul's children, one of Saul's daughters, and now he's the son-in-law. He's a prince by marriage. He has by all rights claim to the throne. And Saul is scared to death. What is he going to do? Well, he tries to kill him. So where can we get the biblical principle out of this? What are we supposed to do with this information? What are we like? Okay, these are great stories, but how does this apply to our lives? Well, I said it first in 1 Samuel 17, is that do not have to have the courage. You do not have to have the strength. You don't have to worry that you are standing alone in whatever battle you're fighting. It comes, your strength, your courage. The person who fights for you is the Lord. Paul said in Romans chapter 8 is that if God is for you, then who could possibly stand against you? Think about this. Metaphorically standing in a valley about to fight a giant, and you feel small and alone, completely exposed, just as David was, without any armor, and all you got is 5 smooth stones, but you don't have to worry. Why? Because God is with you. And it's not just that one battle. He is with you over and over and over again, just as he was with David. And there will be people who try to come against you, who try to tear you down, who try to fight against what God is trying to do with you. And let me tell you, it's not going to work. Why? Because God is with you. Keep your faith in him. Stay in his will. Jesus said, if you remain in me and I remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be given to you. I'm not preaching prosperity gospel. I'm just saying, look, God is with you. And you have the strength and the courage to face anything. We see it all throughout the Bible, and we especially see it in David, and even in the early days of Saul. When God was with them, nothing could possibly stop them. And God, who loves you more than anything in the entire, he loves you so much, there's nothing you can do to make him stop loving you. And he fights for you. He goes before you. And the battle has already been won. And so when you're in those tough times, when you're in those times where you feel like you're alone, you feel like you're lost, you feel like you're hurt, you feel like you can't win, remember what David said in Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He leads me beside the still waters. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He restores my soul. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before my enemies. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's true for David, and that's true for you. So that's today's Good Word from God's Word. I hope you're doing awesome this week. Come check us out tomorrow. Pastor Scott's going to be back bringing a great message, and we hope to see you soon.